right, perfect, awesome. Yeah, thank you all for welcoming me here. Again, my name is Ifeoma Ebo, founding principal of Creative Urban Alchemy. And so this talk is a little bit, it's part academic, it's part practice, it's part just like exploration. I'm a storyteller, and so I like to sort of share stories with people who are come out to sort of like listen to me talk. And so this talk is really exploring designing for intersectionality and inclusion. So just a little bit about me, I'm really quite passionate about designing for inclusion, designing for equity and justice. My practice is really about centering equity and justice in urban design and planning, and I do that in many different ways. I do it through teaching, educating future designers and planners. I also do it through engagement and really having an engagement process that is dynamic and really tries to center dignity in that process, and then also through advocacy, talking to people like you, talking in different places and spaces internationally to encourage others who are architects, planners, built environment professionals to really think about how to design for, develop for more inclusion and equity and justice. And so when you look at me, you can see that I'm a Black person, I'm a woman, and so. But what you don't see, that you might be able to tell by my name, Ifeoma Ebo, is that I'm a daughter of an immigrant. I'm a first-generation American. And so all of these identities, they make, up who I am, my cultural identity. And I'm so proud of them. They also, myself, growing up, experiencing places and spaces with my mother, who's, was an immigrant to this country in the 60s, it really had an influence on the way in which I navigated places and spaces, the way in which I saw public spaces or even just like public buildings. And this is kind of the center of just like this notion of intersectionality. And intersectionality was coined by a Black woman, a lawyer, Kimberly Crenshaw. And she coined this term. She works in the arena of environmental justice. And so it is about the intersection of identities and how those at intersection and overlapping identities, it influences the way you experience issues of injustice, issues of discrimination. Can you hear me? Okay, is that better? Were you able to hear everything I was saying? Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. And so it really, this notion of intersectionality is a really interesting one because it really taps into the fact that the various aspects of who we are, our identities, influences the way in which we experience spaces, the way in which we experience injustice, and it can be compounding. So for someone who is Black, who's a woman, who's an immigrant, you experience many different forms of injustice all at once, and it can be quite more dramatic for that individual. And so a bit about my practice. I mentioned before, my practice really centers equity and justice in urban design and planning. And this is really understanding that equity really is about addressing community need. So it's really about understanding community need and striving to address community need, whereas justice is really about understanding why that need exists and really grappling with, reckoning with why that need exists. And so that's really at the foundation of my practice. And so I have this like multifaceted approach to engagement. The first is really about co-defining the problem. And so when you're working on a built environment challenge or issue, you might come in and say, this is the challenge that we need to solve, but really you need to engage with the experts. And the experts are the people that live in that community and co-define what that problem is collectively. The second part is about co-design, really creating dynamic ways to engage with community. That's not just about checking a checkbox and saying, we did engagement, but really how are you involving people in the design process? How are you creating a design process where people can feel like they got their hands dirty, they were able to actually be a part of designing? And then thirdly is about co-creation. It's really at the placemaking scale, thinking about ways that community can be involved in the co-creating, the making of space. And all of this in an effort to create a sense of collective ownership and really to build trust in a process of designing and planning. And I think that this approach can really strive to address many different forms of justice, whether it's social justice, place-based justice, climate and environmental justice. But then they also feed into an equitable urban design and spatial planning approach to the built environment. So I want to return to a quote that I really love, and this is a quote by Whitney M. Young, and he was a civil rights leader in the 60s. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the civil rights movement was very much rooted in a built environment challenge. It was about conditions that were separate and unequal, built environment conditions that were separate and unequal. And these environments were designed, they were planned. And so he was speaking at a 1968 American Institute of Architects convention. And he was reprimanding architects at that time because this was the thick of the civil rights movement. And he was telling people, you're most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance. Essentially telling them that there's a war going on outside and it has to do with the built environment. And here you are as crafters of the built environment and you're not saying anything. You're continuing to perpetuate the same harms against communities of color, but you're not saying anything. You're not advocating for us through your pen, through your line. And he says, we didn't just suddenly get to this situation, it was carefully planned. And so the question is, what exactly is the situation and what was carefully planned? What was carefully planned is that white supremacy is a spatial practice. That's in essence what he was talking about. And so when I say white supremacy, I'm talking about the dominant idea that whiteness is central to the making of space. That the white identity, the white cultural identity is central to the making of space. And it can be not something that's intentional, it's really something that's ingrained in, I think, many of us. Because it's institutional. It's really rooted in the institutions and the systems of this country. And so without knowing, whiteness becomes a default in designing of spaces. And so I'm just gonna take a little bit of time to sort of go through some examples historically of how that's presented in our built environment, our urban landscapes, before I dive into some practices of today. So this is has anybody heard of redlining? This is a redlining map that was created in the 20s and 30s, and this is of Durham. So you should be familiar with this. And so the redlining map, also known as homeowners loan corporation maps, also known as residential security maps, they were created in the 1920s and 30s, and they're for most major cities. So New York City, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, they all have redline maps. Atlanta, you name it. Major cities across this country had redlining maps, and they were created through a partnership between banks, loan mortgage providing companies, the government, real estate companies. This was a partnership to really determine where were areas of highest value and areas of lowest value. And so the areas that were green and blue, those were the highest valued areas, and those are areas mostly earmarked for those who are white, higher income, high influence. Those that were marked in red and yellow, they were marked in red and yellow for a number of reasons. The primary reason is because black people lived there, or immigrants lived there, or they were areas, low-lying areas that were flooded regularly. So they were just low-valued areas. And so this map determined where banks would allow people to get mortgages and loans. And so those areas that were red and yellow, you could not get a mortgage or a loan in those areas. And so you can imagine if you had a home already in that area and you wanted to upgrade your home, improve your home, you could not get a loan to do that. And so you can imagine over the period of time that this mapping system was in existence, which was about 30 years, by the 50s and 60s, it was sort of like removed from use, but the damage was already done. Many communities who were in the red and yellow areas had experienced decades of lack of investment. And those that were in the green and blue areas, you can imagine that they had significant investment because you could get loans, you could get upgraded, they weren't marginalized, they didn't lack investment. And so when you now look today at these redline maps of cities across the country, and you look at the qualities and conditions of those neighborhoods, you can actually see the stark difference between the areas that were marked green and blue and the areas that were marked red and yellow. And I present this because it frames the ways in which I experience cities, the ways in which I see cities, and understand the challenges that many communities that have been marginalized are facing. This is another example. This is exclusionary zoning in suburbs. So during the 50s and 60s, there was an experience of white flight. You had the building of the white middle class and the movement of people from the inner cities to the suburbs. The suburbs created for sort of this middle income lifestyle. And so, but what was happening in the suburbs is that there was zoning in those locations to exclude industrial use, to exclude low-income housing, so to essentially exclude anybody who was working in factories, who needed low-income housing. And on top of that, to really make it sustainable and really make it stick, covenants were written into the deeds of those homes. So if you were a white home owner and you owned a home in the suburbs, you could not sell your home to a black person. It was written into your deed. It cannot happen. And that was for generations. So that allowed this whole process of white supremacy as a spatial practice to really be ingrained into the built environment. And then furthermore, you had single-family zoning. And single-family zoning limited the uses you could have on your plot of land. So if you had a single-family home, you could not build in the back, you could not build in the front, you could not build up, you could not expand your home to include more family members. It was very limiting. So on top of the restrictive deeds, on top of the exclusionary zoning, you had limitations to what you could do on your plot of land. So further emphasizing this exclusionary notion of these areas. And then urban planners, designers, engineers, they were all complicit in this, knowingly and unknowingly. They were hired to design separate areas, to withhold building permits, to create commercial and industrial buffers between racial groups, their residential areas. So all of this contributed to creating this and upholding whiteness as favorable. Engineers, again, with the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, highways were built all throughout the country, connecting states between one another, but they were built right through those red line areas, right through communities of color, tearing down existing communities. And further, dismantling cultural ties, economic disenfranchisement. So all of this compounding upon communities of color. Granted, these types of actions don't exist today or knowingly exist today. In some forms they do. These highways are still here. They're still the highways that we use to go from one state to another. They cannot be moved. They're set in stone. And so we understand that power relations are very much connected to property relations. Those neighborhoods and communities that are thriving in terms of their built environment, they are able to maintain and upkeep those areas, they experience investment from the city, they experience a sense of power. But those that don't, do not. And so I'm really interested in this notion of shifting power through design. So I love this quote by Mario Gooden. He's a colleague of mine at Columbia University. He's also an author of a book called Dark Space, and he says liberation is a spatial practice, and this gives me a sense of hope. Those same tools that have been used to create oppression, to create division and segregation, they can also be used to create more inclusion, more equity, more justice in the built environment. So now that I've talked a bit about sort of where we've come from in terms of the spatial practices that have caused injustice in the built environment, I want to talk a bit about how do we strive for a more just urban future. And I love this quote by Cornel West. The part in white is his quote where he says, "Justice is what love looks like in public." But then I offer up design justice as what love looks like in public spaces. Has anybody heard of this concept of design justice before? So it's an expanding practice that is really moving across the nation, I would say. And I think during the height of the pandemic, there were a number of practitioners that were really becoming champions and advocates, myself included, for this practice of design justice. And I love this quote by Brian Lee. He's an architect in New Orleans, and he has a practice, he's a principal of a practice called Collocate. And his definition of design justice is really about racial, social, and cultural reparation, that you're striving for cultural equity, racial equity, social equity through the process and outcomes of design. Not just the outcomes of the design, but the process too, just as important as the final product. And he also says that what exactly the design justice does, it seeks to challenge privilege and power structures that use architecture as a tool of oppression. So in all the ways that you've seen design of the built environment, planning tools used as a way to oppress communities, that architecture can also be used to combat those very tools that have been used to oppress, and used as a way to liberate. So there are 5 key aspects of design justice, and I'm going to use them really as a framework for talking about some of the projects that and programs and initiatives that I've been involved in. And so my work really spans nonprofit sector, private, and government. For the last 7 years, I've been working in government while I've also been building my practice. And I found that all of these different principles have been very relevant at different scales, whether it's at the landscape architecture scale, the building scale, public space scale, or even in development. And then the first principle is challenging existing power structures. That really is understanding the systems and how the systems fail us, and what are the architectural representations of those systems, and how can we use the redesign of those architectural representations to really challenge the way those systems work. The second is about amplifying existing expertise. And this is really about understanding that community, they are experts, just the same as architects are experts, planners are experts, developers are experts. Community come with their own expertise, and that should be valued at the same way. And at times that may mean giving stipends for their involvement in projects. The third is building collective power in communities. So I've talked about the many ways that power has been suppressed and oppressed through the built environment, but you can use the built environment to build collective power, share power, support power building. The fourth is lifting up histories of place. So we can't treat places like they are clean slates. Every place has a history. Every place has a heritage, has an existing culture. We must look to it, be inspired by it, reckon with that history, acknowledge that it exists, and not treat places like they are clean slates. And then the fifth is envision space that serves the marginalized. So when we think about those who have been at the margins in our built environments, in our communities and neighborhoods and cities, when we think about their best interests, we're also, really covering all interests, right? Because these are people that have been held back for so long, or those who have been forgotten, not had a voice at the table. So it's important to really envision spaces that serve them. So the first prompt that I will talk about is disrupting power. How might we challenge existing power structures? And so it can seem like, a tall order, particularly for someone who's in the built environment industry, like how do you even just deal with disrupting power? But there are many ways to do that. And so I'm a part of this organization called Dark Matter University. You can find out more at darkmatteruniversity.org. And so it was born in 2020 by a large number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color academics across the country. What we were acknowledging and actually coming to realization for, between all of us, having Zoom calls and meeting, through the internet, when we were all meeting through the internet, was that the ways in which we were taught, the culture of architecture studio, the culture of planning studio, really didn't acknowledge our identities, our cultural identities, the intersection of our identities in the ways in which we were taught about the built environment. And we wanted to come up with a new way to teach students about that, so that students understood that it's not only about Corbusier and some of the European architects that we always learn about, or even European architecture that we always learn about, but there are many different ways of designing, building. There's so much to learn culturally across the world. There are so many paradigms for architecture in the built environment. And why can't we tap into that? Why can't we teach studios and courses that elevate and amplify that? Why don't we teach this history that I've just shared with you today in depth, so people understand the ways, the harms that have been caused in the past by the built environment, by practitioners? And so that's what Dark Matter University was born. And it really is a space of collectivity. It's a space of collective action. It's a way that we disrupt power. And DMU, for short, is an anti-racist design justice school collectively seeking the radical transformation of education and practice towards a just future. It's just that. We are really looking and being very introspective about our work, about the ways in which we work, and about the ways in which we work together with community, and really considering who is the client in the projects that we work on. And so there are many different forms, there are many aspects to our mission. The first is really about creating new forms of knowledge, because this is pioneering. Our architecture schools, our planning schools have not been about this, and so anything that's produced from now on is really about creating new forms of knowledge production, and new forms of institution and power. So we work inside academia. We teach courses in the typical academic institutions. We also teach courses outside the academic institutions, and that's the way in which we build our own power. We have new forms of collectivity and practice, so understanding that it doesn't only have to be about the individual. It can be about the group, about the collective teaching, collectively. It can also be about working with students to co-produce knowledge. That knowledge can be continuously being produced. It's not only about the base knowledge that's always being served in the academic sphere. And new forms of community and culture. And this is in terms of a culture of the studio environment. That experience doesn't have to be oppressive. That experience doesn't have to be exclusive and really make people feel like they don't belong. And new forms of design, that out of this form of knowledge production, collective practice, that there will be new forms of design that come out of that work. And so for me in my practice, what that means when I teach is it means bringing community into the process of teaching students. And so bringing young people from community and partnering them with college students as they're learning, so they can share the understanding of architecture and planning, and the community can share their expertise. And so there's this co-production of knowledge and practice that happens between community and students, and they begin to understand how to convert the ways in which they understand the language that they're learning around architecture and the built environment, but make that accessible to community, understand community as client, and understand what it means to share ideas with people who don't practice, who don't understand architecture and planning. And then it also means when they have their design reviews that community is also invited to that process. And so it's not only about design critics critiquing students' work, but it's also about community coming in and saying, oh, actually that's not relevant here, or actually that would work very well here. It's understanding the cultural patterns and nuances in a community and how they can design to best serve the people that are going to be living there. And so what has come out of this way of teaching, this new form of co-production of knowledge, has been really thinking about these freeways and highways underneath them and how to reimagine them as spaces of cultural heritage, as spaces where people can connect with history. Also thinking about the underneath elevated train lines that have segregated communities, and really think about how they can be a place where community can come together, a place where people can address issues of food insecurity, can address issues of building spaces for entrepreneurship. And also thinking about spaces around public housing and those spaces in between, and how they can be a place for people to gather, to celebrate, to experience Black joy as a radical act. And also places where people can co-create artistic elements, co-create ideas, co-create new futures, new visions, but really a space an outlet for community members to be able to be a part of the production of public space. And then also reimagining spaces to address issues of food injustice, economic injustice, and really thinking about how design can be tools for forwarding and sharing power in the community. And then it's also about understanding unique cultural heritage. For example, the heritage in African American culture of quilt making, and how that can even be a way of designing and building and making materials that then are used to adorn the built environment, so that people are walking through their community and they're seeing a representation of themselves. That this sort of really understanding the unique legacies in communities can be a way of making, can be a way of allowing cultural heritage to influence and inspire design ideas. So when thinking about disrupting power, how might we challenge existing power structures? I showed an example of Dark Matter University, and that for us is a way of challenging existing power structures in academia. And so for us, the way in which you disrupt power is to create new forms of design, really thinking about being inspired by the history and culture of place, rethinking institutional spaces, and that can be whether it's spaces for academic learning, spaces for cultural exploration, whatever institutions that are out there. These are institutions that have been ingrained in our life forever. And so when we're thinking about those institutions, that's the foundation of where the systems of oppression are based. They are based in our institutions. And so if we think about reimagine those spaces, that can actually connect to reimagining how those institutions show up in our life. And then creating new methods of design practice, and that really is about thinking about ways that community can be involved in the design process through a co-creation process. So the next prompt is building power. How might we build power in communities? So before we were just thinking about disrupting power, now how might we rebuild power in communities? So for 3 years, I spent time working for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York City as the first in-house design advisor. And we were working in 15 communities across New York City. And these 15 communities are also neighborhoods that were formerly redlined. But they were also neighborhoods that were experiencing extreme crime, like rise in crime. And it's not because, and these were also public housing communities, but people will attribute the fact that this crime was occurring in these neighborhoods because it was public housing, but that's not the case. If we actually think back to the impacts of redlining and the ways in which they disenfranchise communities, we can create a clear connection between the fact that these communities have been held back for so long without economic development, without opportunities and amenities in the community, that what other options do people have in a community? What other impacts can you see that will come out of that kind of legacy, that history? And so this project wasn't about addressing crime through design. This project really was about empowering communities and also thinking about alternatives to aggressive law enforcement as a tool for addressing crime prevention. And it also was a way of rethinking the notion of CEPTED and CPTED stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. It's an acronym. It was a methodology of designing that was started in the 70s. It was created in the 70s by an architect, Oscar Newman. And it was really born out of this notion that there was crime occurring in public housing. And so he compiled this like package of design tools and design methods and approaches for thinking about spaces in and around public housing. And much of it was like cameras, fencing, bars on windows, the notion that if there are broken windows in a public housing development, there was crime there. It was a place that was like, unsafe. But what it did was it really created a concept of these communities as places that were unworthy, that places that were scary and not to be visited, including the people that live there should be, behind cages and treated as if they are negative and could, tear down their own communities. It wasn't empowering. It wasn't about empowering the people that live there. It wasn't about investing in that community. And so we were really thinking about approaches to the built environment that were antithesis to that, really thinking about how to empower communities through the built environment. And so what we started first was really a capacity building program. We wanted to really create space for leaders in the community, that lived in public housing, that experienced injustice from the criminal justice system, to really empower them to step up and become leaders in transforming public spaces around their community. And so what we did was we had a capacity building program where we taught them things like human-centered design, placemaking, various concepts of design, so that they can begin to connect their lived experience with the language of design and be able to actually come up with strategies, co-create strategies with government. And so the initiative was really trying to encourage partnerships between community and government, but empowering communities to be at the forefront of those solutions. So they created these things called action plans, where they had a budget of $50,000. They got trained on learning and understanding. They also got trained in understanding crime prevention through environmental design, because we were trying to help them understand what has already been done in their community and how they can come up with solutions that are so much more effective. And it was really trying to build social cohesion in the community so that people could collectively problem solve together, that they didn't have to go to police, that that issues that happen in their community, they oftentimes know who are the perpetrators and what their story is, that there's victimization happening here, and that they could collectively come up with solutions together, but that the public space, transforming public space, could be a way of addressing those issues. And it was really about getting at the root causes of why crime was occurring. So this is one of the tools for capacity building. This is a heat map. And so the heat mapping exercise was really about helping community understand just what is a map and where is their building located in their community. And really beginning to connect some of the undesirable activities that they experience on a regular basis to locations on a map. And so you can see there are different colors there, and so the yellow is for like public urination, and red is for like the sale of drugs. And so this was all sort of like determined by community, what happened where. But then there were other maps that were created, positive maps, pro-social activity maps. So where were senior citizens hanging out? Where were young people hanging out? And I'm having conversations about how do we shift some of that pro-social activity to locations where that undesirable activity was occurring, and what were the aspects of those spaces where undesirable activity was occurring, and how could they change that and shift that? And so we know power is a chameleon. It takes on the texture of its environment. If a community, as I mentioned before, if a community you walk outside your door and you see that your community is falling apart, you have this sense of just like disempowerment. I don't have a way of changing the way this looks. I don't feel empowered to do that. And so this program was really about empowering communities. So this is one example of one of the public space transformations. This is in Staten Island, Stapleton Houses. It's a tennis court. You can see that tennis is not the sport of choice here. There is no net there. There are no tennis rackets anywhere. You can see there a pile of trash in the corner. It's just like, why? Why is this happening? It's a beautiful space that can be used, that can be programmed. Why is it not being used effectively? And so the resident team in this housing development, they chose this space because what they were experiencing as the root cause of crime in their community is that substance abuse was a major issue in their community. And they wanted to really create a way that support could be provided to their community. And so they wanted to transform this space into a resource hub. And so they worked with architecture students at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture and Planning, and they came up with some visualizations about, how could they transform this space into a resource hub using what I mentioned before, the $50,000, which really doesn't go far in New York City. So they came up with some ideas, and the idea here was to come up with some kiosks so that whenever they wanted to have a program in this space, they could wheel the kiosks out and have a number of different programs. And so that's what they did. They partnered with a local artist. They created these kiosks. The kiosks are stored in a shipping container where the person taking the photo is standing on top of. And whenever they want to have a market, whenever they want to have a resource hub, a fair, or whatever, if they want to invite nonprofit organizations or government institutions to come and provide resources and training and support for those who are experiencing depression, anxiety, who are dealing with substance abuse, this has become a platform for that. This has become a space where they can begin to address the challenges and issues in their community that are resulting in criminal activity. And this was empowering for them because they have a tool now that they can use whenever they want. And they also are connected to this network of organizations that are willing to support them by just providing the information and resources that they need. So build power. How do we build power in communities? We use engagement to support networking. So that connecting the community leaders to a network of organizations and government institutions that could provide resources for them, that was power building. They now have a network that they can tap into and connect to and use that space as a place to display those connections. Share knowledge and information. Just as simple as that. Sometimes just sharing information, research that's been collected, understanding design ideas, design methodologies, sometimes that's all people need in order to be able to connect the ideas that they have in their head and the built environment around them and how to make those ideas realized. And then create opportunities for co-design, opportunities where people can be involved in the making. It can be very empowering to go from an idea to something that's realized, but we take it for granted as architects and planners. Strength and power. How do you lift up the history and culture of place? Another sort of tenet of design justice. And so this is really about, as I mentioned before, the heritage and history of a place is important to be inspired by when designing. And so this is another organization that I helped to found in 2016. It's a nonprofit organization called the Black Space Urbanist Collective. And we are a collective of, we are a nonprofit organization based in New York City, but we have affiliates in Atlanta, Oklahoma City, Chicago, and growing. And our mission is that we demand a present and future where Black people, Black spaces, and Black culture matter and thrive. And we are a collective of architects, urbanists, planners, economists, lawyers, you name it, because we understand that cities and communities are dynamic and they require multidisciplinary approaches to addressing challenges. And so we want to support and work in, with, and for Black communities. You can find out more about Black Space on blackspace.org. And so this is sort of like a constellation of how we work. We center Black publics, Black spaces, whether it's physical Black spaces, Black communities, virtual Black spaces, but the Black publics is sort of at the heart of why we work. And around that, the ways in which we work is that we have we create neighborhood strategies with community. We create published content as a form of advocacy, customized learnings, urbanist experience for practitioners. And then even with, outside of that, I mentioned before, we have affiliates in Chicago and Oklahoma and in New York City. And then even within, around that, we have the ways in which our board is structured. We have programming committee, governance committee, communications committee. This is how we build power for ourselves so that we are sustainable, so that we are able to support communities and work in, with, and for communities on a strong footing. And so we started really with one project working in Brownsville, which is a historic African-American community in Brooklyn, New York. And we really were thinking about gentrification and how do we really grapple with the impacts of gentrification. And so it's such a major, gentrification with a big G, such a big challenge. But there are so many facets of it. And one aspect of it is cultural retention, sort of like cultural displacement. The loss of the cultural history and even just like leaders in a community. And so we were really thinking about how do we use a creative process to grapple with that, cultural conservation, really supporting the retention of culture in a community. And so we did a number of things. We went to where people were. And we didn't have any we didn't know what the final outcome would be. We just know that we wanted to do things differently. We wanted to engage differently. And so we went to different places in the community and we listened to neighborhood stories. We captured their stories. We engaged with existing community activations where the festivals were happening, where the young people were hanging out. We went to those places and spaces and we talked to people. We brought a map of Brownsville everywhere we went, and we put up that map and then had people really point out where are the places and spaces where they feel free, where they feel like they could be themselves, where they feel like their culture is manifested. And we mapped those cultural assets. And we made sure the funding that we got from philanthropy to support our initiative, that we funneled that money into local businesses. So we wanted to make sure that we were addressing equity and justice in every facet of the work that we were doing. And so we also did some research in trying to understand how does Brownsville conserve its own culture? And we saw that there was just this rich practice of just like public murals throughout the community. They had Old Timers Day Festival to really amplify and elevate seniors in the community. They had writing circles where there were writers who were born and raised in Brownsville writing stories about Brownsville. They had street naming and building naming ceremonies to name streets and buildings after people that have passed away in the community. They had parades, events, summits. They had griots, which are storytellers in the community. And so we saw that there was this rich tapestry of work that was already happening. And we were thinking, how can we support this work? How can we be a connector in this work? And so one of the ways is that we wanted to also hold ourselves accountable in the work. Like, how do we make sure that we're always sort of like operating with dignity, with respect, amplifying local expertise? And so we created a set of principles for ourselves. We need to be change agents. We need to start with relationship building, amplify Black joy. These are kind of things that we all knew at the back of our mind, but we wanted to put it down on paper to make sure that we sort of like collectively continue to sort of look back on those principles. And so our practice was iterative. We didn't want to have a streamlined process where you sort of start here, you end here. We wanted to go through a cyclical process. We were constantly reflecting, co-creating with community, listening, being humble, activating public space, and then going back to reflecting and co-developing. And so we did sketching. We worked with teenagers to sort of test out ideas in public space. We worked with younger children to sort of come up with what do they want to see in public space. We were inspired by learning and listening. We tested out things in public space, and we repeated over and over again until we got to a concrete idea of where we wanted to go. And we didn't know that this would be the outcome. The outcome was a set of 14 principles for practitioners working in, with, and for Black communities, and it's called the Black Space Manifesto. And so that became our creative product. It became a product that now we use to center ourselves. It's a sort of a part of our own mission statement, our Black Space Manifesto. And so some of the principles, like move at the speed of trust, really capture the fact that we felt aimless in the work that we were doing, but actually, in hindsight, it wasn't aimless. We were moving at the speed of which the people that we were working with, that we were connecting with, that they trusted us. They trusted that the outcomes of what we were doing stood to benefit them, and that we were co-creating those outputs with them. We were planning with and designing with, and not just like, getting feedback. We were actually creating ways that people could be involved in the process of making. We were centering the lived experience. Every time we engaged with people, we made sure that what they shared with us actually fed into our thinking, and it wasn't disregarded. We strived to sort of reckon with this past on this community. This is another formerly redlined community, and so we wanted to think of ways to reckon with that in the work we were doing. And we wanted to really sort of think about how can this be a way of working for cultural producers. And when I say cultural producers, these are the people that they create the parades, the festivals, they do the murals in the community. And what are ways that we could foster network building between them and create opportunities for them to co-create in public space. And so that was kind of what came out of the project, was forming this network of cultural producers and co-creating ideas in public space. But this manifesto guided us through that work, and we worked with a graphic designer to sort of like amplify this work, and we released it in 2018. And it just went viral. It's been recognized by Guggenheim Museum and Museum of Modern Art in New York City, the Oakland Museum in California, and it's been displayed widely. So you can find the Black Space Manifesto at blackspace.org. So when thinking about strengthening power in a community and lifting up histories and culture of place, you need to listen to community stories and really find ways of capturing those stories and really going to where people are. Engaging with cultural producers, so the people that are actually already doing the work, but really thinking about how you can partner with them to amplify cultural heritage. Remember, this was really thinking about gentrification and how we can really deal with that issue of cultural erasure. And be inspired by existing cultural heritage. It's so easy to neglect and to pass over, but there's so much inspiration that can come from it. There's so much value add that it can have to a process. So the next prompt is healing power. How might we envision spaces that serve marginalized communities? And this is the final prompt, and I think one of the most important because, as I mentioned before, when you think about the needs of those who have been marginalized, you really address the needs of everyone. And this is really about centering equity in the work. So this is kind of in New York City how we deal with on-the-spot sort of crime prevention. These are floodlights that are used often when crime occurs, when there's like rising crime in a community. Most often, these are used around public housing communities, low-income communities as an approach and strategy, but they will be left for years even, and they're so bright, they're blinding. They have engines, and so they're really loud. And so there was this study across New York City by this organization called Crime Lab, where they were researching the impact that these floodlights could have on crime levels in a community. And so they were able to find that, oh yes, these floodlights, they actually positively impacted crime levels. So crime levels went down when they were put up, but what the Crime Lab study failed to acknowledge was that they also a lot of things went down, like playing hopscotch in public space, barbecuing in public space, hanging out at night in public space, enjoying public space. All of that went down. Why? Because these things are very loud, they're very bright, they shine into people's living rooms, into their bedrooms. They're an eyesore. It's an environmental injustice to have these things around public housing communities. And it's sort of like an innovation and injustice of all the things I've mentioned before, to sort of use this as a tool for crime prevention in communities of color. And so this is one of the things I grappled with when working in the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, is really what is a different approach to dealing with this on-the-spot treatment of lighting, of addressing improved lighting in public housing. And so there was a partnership between the Mayor's Office of Technology, the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and the Economic Development Corporation to really think about innovative solutions and really center community in that work. So partnering community organizations with tech entrepreneurs to come up with new tools for transforming public space, and also dealing with community safety. So really to activate nightlife in areas where people are experiencing high crime. But also just in the same vein, as I'd mentioned before, that really supports power building, strengthening of power in the community. And so this was a program in particular where young people were trained in coding so that they could be at the forefront of using technology as a tool to activate the night in their community. And so they were taught in coding by a local tech company. And then also children in the community, they were partnered with Arup, which is an international engineering firm, to come up with lanterns. And they had this engagement process where kids would come up with some of the artwork that sat in the lanterns. So the lanterns could be displayed in their community as a way of lighting the night, and also got people outside to see what their children were producing. And then, so this is one of the renderings that was created by the teens that were part of the coding program, and it was a way of them to reflect how they saw the tools that they would create, projecting their art into public space and as an alternative to lighting up the night. And so this was the outcome. They created two tools. One was LED lighting that was attached to existing light poles in the community. And then also a projection system. And both of them were sensor-based. So the more people that came outside to sort of witness the display of this artwork, the more the artwork would jump, and there would be more images that the students co-created, projected into public space. And so it became a spectacle. It became something that people were excited to come out in their community to go and check out and see. And then the kids felt empowered because they were at the forefront of creating this new innovative way of lighting up the night in their community. And the Department of Transportation was a part of it. They were, all of the agencies came together to support this initiative. And this also can be a tool that can be used in other communities, so a program to sort of have young leaders at the forefront of transforming public spaces in their community. So this is another project. This is now in Morrisania in the Bronx. This is another formerly redlined community. And during the 70s in the Bronx, there were a number of ways that landlords were trying to push residents out by burning down buildings. And so you had, throughout the Bronx, you had a number of buildings that were just like torn down, broken down. I mean, this was the condition of the environment. This was kind of like, an extension of the injustice of the redlining in the 20s and 30s. And so this is kind of like the legacy and history of this particular community. And so I spent time working for the Department of Housing Preservation and Development and developing affordable housing across the city, but really thinking about particularly housing that's developed in communities of color, formerly redline communities, to make sure that this kind of history is understood and acknowledged, and really also acknowledging what has been the impact of that history. So one of the challenges in the Bronx is that there's food insecurity in the South Bronx in particular. And so this architecture team with the developer partnered together to develop arbor housing in the Bronx. And so they actually researched this history. They wanted to understand what are sort of some of the challenges that have faced this community as a result of this legacy of injustice. And so they really understood food insecurity be an issue that they wanted to explore, really explore food justice. And so they developed this housing development to really think about health and wellness. And so one of the open spaces that they designed here had a gym features throughout the open space. So every encounter that happens, every way that people interact with this open space has to do with their health. It has to do with improving their wellness, their health and wellness. And so that was sort of one of the underlying themes of this development. And then on the rooftop, they had 9,000 square feet of rooftop garden where people could go learn how to cultivate plants and vegetables, and also have a place where they can get nutrition and learn about nutrition and be able to steward that space. And that is empowering, to be able to steward a garden that then grows food that then you can use for your own family in a place that has this history and legacy of food injustice. And so when thinking about healing power and healing spaces and really thinking about how to serve marginalized communities, you create spaces for community stewardship where people can become leaders in stewarding spaces and co-creating spaces. Address community health, whether it's the health of just like their public spaces and being able to go outside and feel excited to be in public space, or even just your own nutritional health and how can space support nutritional health in the community. And then also engage youth. You know, the spaces that architects and planners create are not for tomorrow, they're for like 5 years, 10 years down the line. And so the young people of today, they're going to be the people that inhabit and use those spaces in the future. And so it's so important to involve them in that process of co-creation because they will stand to benefit from those spaces in the end. Share power. How might we amplify existing expertise? So this is just like some images from my childhood. This is a neighborhood I grew up in Brooklyn. It's Park Slope. And this image here on the left-hand side is the high school I went to. The image on the right is the elementary school I went to, PS 39. Right across the street from PS 39 is this library, the Brooklyn Public Library, where I would go after school. And so these are just like, this is like going down memory lane for me. It's fond memories of these places and spaces. But you can see that there's like an architectural style here that's sort of like permeates through all of them. And then I'll show you some other buildings too. These two buildings as well, also located in New York. This is the Juvenile Detention Center in the Bronx, and this is a jail, a city jail in Brooklyn. And you can see that they also have very similar architectural style. And so I spent time working for the New York City Department of Design and Construction. We noticed that there was this relationship between the buildings of socialization, of just like the socialization of our children, and the buildings for incarceration and detention. And that there was this like visual relationship between them. And that was sort of like, it was challenging. It was challenging to sort of understand that like our buildings that are sort of spaces of addressing criminal activity and the spaces of education looked exactly the same. And so we wanted to really inspire architects when designing public buildings, public assets, to think differently about our libraries, our public schools, our police stations, to be more inviting, to not look like places that are jails or detention centers. And so we crafted the guiding principles for design and construction excellence that centered equity, sustainability, resilience, and healthy living. And I focus in particular on equity for this. And these guiding principles, they weren't meant to be required. They were really aspirational, to really encourage the consultants who were designing public buildings and public streets to aspire for something greater. And they were meant also to influence the way in which our public infrastructure was designed and built. And so when thinking about equity in design, we wanted to engage with communities. So we engaged with a number of communities to really understand what people thought about equity in the built environment. What did it mean for them? And we asked questions like, how can the design of public buildings allow users to feel entitled or invited to the space, to improve access to services, to provide opportunities to gather with others? Because our public buildings are some of the most important buildings in any neighborhood. They're the places where we access government services, and so most importantly, they should be the spaces that people feel invited to come into, that they're not hard to navigate, they're not inaccessible. And so what came out of this process of engagement were 5 key aspects of equitable design. The first was convey a sense of welcome to all, so making sure that wherever our public buildings were, that people felt welcome into those spaces. And a big part of that was really thinking about the space outside the building. what was the public realm look like? What the street in front of that library? Your experience going up the steps into the library, and how did that experience make you feel like you wanted to come into that space? Ease access to resources. So no matter what a person's cultural background was, if their physical impediments, their whatever language that they spoke, that they were easily able to come in and navigate the resources in any public building. Strengthen communities. The buildings that for sure are going to be in every community are your public buildings. And so they should tap into the cultural heritage of that neighborhood and strengthen the community, create spaces where people can come together, gather, meet, brainstorm, problem solve. Respect histories and cultures. So as I mentioned before, history and culture can be a space of inspiration. And so really allowing history and culture to inspire and design process. And then involved with needs and change, understanding that our public buildings are going to be in a community indefinitely, and they should be able to connect with future generations. So this is one example. This is the East Flatbush Library in a historic Black community in Brooklyn. And you can see that this building, it looks like a bunker. It looks like, there will be cannons on top, and that there's a war that's to be won through this building. And so it doesn't really give you the feeling that it's a place of learning and sort of like educational development where you go and get books. It's a library. It should, be more inviting than this. And so this was sort of one of the examples of the type of building that we wanted to really address through these design principles. And so this design by 11 Bets, an architecture firm in New York City, was quite simple. Through the treatment of the facade, transforming it so that it was transparent, really allowing you to see the activity occurring inside the building, really making that environment more legible, making it more inviting. And whether you're on the inside or outside, you kind of feel safe because you can see what's happening outside of the building or on the interior of the building. And so just that slight change really transformed this library into more inviting and equitable space. So for the past 4 years, I've been an advisor to the Mayor's Office of Helsingborg, Sweden. And for the past 4 years, they've been working on an expo on ways that they're using technology to improve the use of public space in their city. And so, one thing they're also looking at is how to create more inclusive spaces. What's interesting about Helsingborg is they're very, very, very lily white city, very Swedish. They pride themselves on their Swedish culture. But what's also interesting is that about 5 or 10 years ago, they opened up their borders to Middle Eastern refugees. And perhaps they thought maybe the people would come in and then go away, but this community did not go away. And so they now are thinking about and are grappling with social tensions because they welcomed this community in, not all for altruism, but really because they wanted to raise their tax base and their working population. Their population is decreasing, and that's happening across Europe. And so what's interesting about this is that they're now thinking about how do we create a more inclusive society for this community that's here now? How do we embrace them, bring them in, and how do we use the built environment to do that? So they're thinking about that in public space. They're also thinking about that with an inclusive design scorecard that allows architects to really be able to look at what are some of the values around inclusive design that the city government wants to uphold. And so these are some of the spaces. I was just there in June when they had this expo, and they sort of showcased some of the ways in which they're using technology to transform public space and also create more inclusive environments. And so these are one of the spaces that they created. And so part of our advisory group was really to to sort of spark some ideas. And one of the ideas that was sparked was co-creation. Co-creation as a tool for creating more inclusive environments. And so this space here is a space that pops up all over the city, and there are spaces for co-creating ideas. You can also connect to technology in this space, so you can get free Wi-Fi in this space. So they have these sort of like pop-up living rooms where you can come, sit down, have dialogues, brainstorm, and really co-create ideas. And you can see that, these are some of the other places. And so they are also seen as sort of safe spaces for people of different cultures, different backgrounds, different genders. They are also accessible spaces. I mentioned before that you can connect to internet there. So they really create the internet connectivity as a way of encouraging people and inviting them to use the space. And so this is another co-created space that was created, and this was a competition that was won by students at Lund University School of Architecture, and this is called the People's Voice. And it's a really unique space. I think this hollow space is created by containers for soda bottles. So they're all just soda bottle containers, just stacked, one on top of the other. It's creating this hollow space. But what's fascinating about it is that inside the space, when you go in there, you can write a note about equality. So whatever comes to your heart that you feel about equality and equity in public space, you can write it down in whatever language you so choose. Those messages will then be sandblasted into concrete, and then the containers, the red containers, will be replaced by concrete at some point, and this will be a roaming sort of art piece that moves around the city. And so you can imagine that as it moves around the city, this hollowed space will be filled in with concrete blocks, and that they will reflect the many different voices and stories and opinions and ideas and feelings and sentiments of people throughout the city. And so it will sort of be a form of inclusive design, a way that they all co-created together this space that represents the people's voice. So when thinking about sharing power, how might we amplify existing expertise? You can co-create design principles. I use that widely in my design practice, really thinking about establishing a set of values or principles that are co-created with community that then inspire design. And design opportunities for co-creation. I think that example in Sweden was really amazing in that it really created a way that people could be involved in the making of something that they can see on a daily basis and experience. So finally, I love this quote by Adrienne Marie Brown. She has this wonderful book called Emergent Strategy. And this idea of moving at the speed of trust was inspired, and she writes about it in this book. And I want to read it out loud because I think it really inspires me as a designer, as an architect, as a visionary of future spaces. She says, "We must imagine new worlds that transition ideologies and norms so that no one sees Black people as terrorists and aliens, but all of us as potential cultural and economic innovators. This is a time travel exercise of the heart. This is collaborative ideation. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us?" And I love this quote because I see my work as a time travel exercise. I'm not designing for tomorrow, I'm designing for the future. And so the future that we all must hold, the visualizations that a designer creates is really a vision of the future that we all must hold. And so I love this image here. This is created by a friend of mine, Olalekan Jeyefus. He's a widely known designer and architect and artist, and he creates these visualizations of the future. And I love this visualization because it has two Black men standing on the corner, and they're just like smiling, enjoying themselves. This can be seen as criminal activity. Someone might see two Black men smiling on a corner and want to call the police. But in this visualization, it seems so commonplace. It seems like something that should happen. And then there's a whole environment that he's created around these two men that sort of makes this seem evocative, like you want to go into that space, you want to experience and see what they're seeing. And I think as designers, our visualization should do just that. They should really create the future that we want to see, the future where Black and brown people are not seen as murderers and terrorists, but they're seen as cultural and economic innovators. And we have the power to do that as designers because we create those visualizations. And those visualizations, they sit in people's minds of just like, oh, that's the future that I'm going to see happen. So thank you again so much for this opportunity to share with all of you. I just have 3 key takeaways here. The first is, in your work of the built environment work, center equity and justice, or in any work that you're doing, whether you're working in built environment or not. Co-create values with community. That's sort of at the beginning of this co-creation process is what are the values and principles that all will uphold. And then also move at the speed of trust, move at the speed of which people trust the process that you're facilitating, and they trust that the outcomes of the product will stand to benefit them. So thank you again so much. And I'll be open to questions.
Thank you, Ifeoma, so much for that incredibly insightful talk. I'd like to open up the floor for any questions.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
And thank you. My name is Nick Neptune, and I'm on the verge of tears because everything that you've spoken to and you've shared with us tonight, I'm listening and hearing as someone who's lived with it, who's grown up with it, who's visited family living in public housing in North Carolina, in Washington, D.C., in New York City. And when visiting with them as a kid, I didn't think twice about it. It was just normal. Mm-hmm. But as I've come into, adulthood, in my mid-30s, I'm not, it's been such a wild experience learning about what our community was effectively facilitated into. Mm-hmm. You hear what I'm saying? And to cut to the chase, it's like as you learn about that and you reflect on your role, your position, your capacity to address it today and moving forward, it can be overwhelming. I think just to put it briefly, I'm grateful to be here in the city of Raleigh now, doing the best personally and professionally with a lot of, frankly, colleagues here in this room, trying to contribute to just better neighborhoods, a better quality of life, for all of us, for sure, but especially for those of us coming from communities of color that historically, per your presentation, it's like, we didn't have a choice. Mm-hmm. This is literally how we were slotted into neighborhoods. I think the question here, we have such an incredible audience of present day practitioners, many of whom I know and have a great respect for. We've got community leaders like Carmen Cawthon in here, historians who are actively sharing information and knowledge with us. I believe I see Mitchell Silver in here actively working to share knowledge and information with us in our community, trying to uplift and celebrate as best we can. But we also have a next generation here with us. Present day students, but these are future professionals, practitioners. I have been able to spend some time with all of them. They're very talented, right up front. I see you. Well, in all seriousness, so my question is, if you could offer to them, the thing is, I'm over here just feeling reaffirmed and just re-energized. Mm-hmm. You have validated, I haven't had the time to do the years of academic study and practice and, yada, yada, yada. but you're presenting the facts, the truth, right, to a community of present day and future practitioners. And if you could maybe articulate, 2 or 3 sort of words of guidance and wisdom as they sort of chart their own paths, I mean, it is a blessing and a privilege to share this evening with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think, the things I share with my students is, think about the ways in which you talk about your work in a way that can be accessible. And when I say accessible, I mean like clear and plain language. I'm sure much of what I shared today was understandable to you, right? I'm very intentional about that too, about the ways in which I share knowledge that can reach many different people. And so I think, when we're trained in academia, sort of the canon sort of has us talking in very encrypted language, and you have to think about how can you make that plainer for people. And this is when you're working particularly in communities that have been neglected for so long. Or I think any community, you have to think about how are you translating this architectural language into more accessible language. I think that's the first thing. And the second is any place, anything you design is situated in a place. It's situated in a community. It's not, I remember in architecture school, we were designing sort of like these spaceships that land in places, and there's they're clean slates. So there's like a blank canvas. That's never a condition. And so you always want to sort of push, where is this place? Who is this place? And who lives here? And how do we understand who lives here? And how can that understanding influence what we're making? I think those are sort of the 2 things that I try to center in the work that I do and the way in which I teach.
Ifeoma, I've known you for a while. I've never seen you present. I think we're all blessed with your journey and your lived experience, which is real, which we could all see. I think it's best when your lived experiences are reflected in your practice. My question to you and those that were listening, a lot of what Ifeoma was talking about was pre-Black Lives Matter. This was a lifetime of work. If you notice, Black Space created in 2018. If you heard what Ifeoma said, this went back. A lot of us worked in this space for our lifetime. But Black Lives Matter for some was an awakening. And so my question to you is, how has your practice changed post Black Lives Matter? Because there are a lot of people who now have been awakened and perceive themselves as allies. But how is this sustained long term? Because a lot of people feel a sense of guilt and want to help.
Yeah.
But this is, as you know, a generational journey. So how has it changed post Black Lives Matter in your practice? And how do you recommend that is sustained? Because I believe what is happening now needs to be permanent.
Yeah, no, that's really a great point. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Mitch. I think healing is a really big theme right now that I'm experiencing and that I'm seeing as really important in the work. I think, what the pandemic revealed for many of us who already knew, but that there are health inequities existing in our cities, and there are neighborhoods that have been struggling for a really long time until the pandemic just exposed that and really sort of just brought to our attention neighborhoods who are grappling with health inequities. And I think, the ways in which the design process and the design product deals with healing, and so that's whether it's mental health, physical health, or just healing of relationships, I think is important because there's a lot of trauma. We all went through a very traumatic experience over the last few years. And so in whatever ways that the design process can really grapple with dealing with trauma, creating space for people to grieve. And it's not really the way how we're trained. We're not trained to do that, but it's going to show up anyway because we've all been traumatized. And so what I'm also seeing is that designers really understanding the importance of creating space for people to grieve, so that more space can be created to imagine, to reimagine, to dream. And so when you don't create that space for grief, when you don't reckon with that past, it's going to undermine whatever work that you're doing. So I think I'm trying to learn practices about like trauma-informed design, creating space for grieving, creating space for reckoning with the history, because I think the trauma of today is awakening the past traumas. And especially the fact that like everybody's quote unquote woke now and understands like, oh, highways and freeways and the impact they've had on communities and how they've affected people's health over time. Like all of that, we need to reckon with it, acknowledge it, and then think about the ways in which we practice strives to grapple with it.
That was a question. I have just one word of advice. Being a commissioner in New York City right after Black Lives Matter, I remember a lot of my allies were asking me, what can I do? And that is a fair and noble question. But I said that is the wrong question. The first question you should ask is, how do I feel? I just experienced in watching a man being murdered on television, before we get what do I do, because what do I do is about your feelings. How do I feel, how do we feel, is really understanding how we are interpreting what we just watched. The doing comes later. How do I feel comes first. Everything Ifeoma shared. People went through 2 years of trauma through COVID, but there were communities beyond, going back for redlining, that had generational after generational after generational trauma. The first question is, how do you feel? And once you understand that collective pain, allow people to grieve, then you can move into the what can I do. So I just want to share that because that became so prominent right after Black Lives Matter. Everyone came to me, what can I do? And I said, stop, just listen first, then we'll work together on doing later. So I just want to share that with the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Hello, thanks for the talk again. A more technical question from my side, because I'm involved in a little bit in city planning right now, and I'm trying to, really connect with the community. Coming from Germany also, so, you talked about those alternative lighting spaces with the projections, and also about the arbor housing for affordable living. Mm-hmm. And so a little bit of a technical question, because I'm really interested, did you face any challenges in building those spaces? Or I don't know if it's already built, but what challenges do you see in building those spaces? Because I know greenhouses can also be expensive. And when you can maybe outline a few of those challenges, can you also address a few options that could help fund those projects to really enable people like me to, see further and actually bring ideas and visions into action?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. And I think it's definitely an important one because all of this work is not easy. And they don't happen swiftly, especially in a city like New York City that has a very complex regulatory environment. It makes things quite difficult. With the lighting project in public space, that one, it's kind of one of those, it was a very short-term project. It's kind of one of those projects where, you can throw 20,000 to 50,000 at it and, you can see something be realized. It's not like the housing project where that could take years. And so that project in particular, we brought all the different agencies to the table, and I think that was the first step. It's really making sure different agencies come to the table and that they are coordinated and they work collaboratively. One of the challenges in New York City, and Mitch will probably talk about that as well is that some agencies work very siloed. You have like, the Department of Transportation works independently. They don't, coordinate with the Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. And so a development can happen, or just like transformation of spaces can happen very disjointly. And so this was one project where the agencies came together, because if we didn't have the Department of Transportation involved, we wouldn't have been able to put those projections, the projector up, or even put the lighting up. So we had to bring, the Department of Transportation to the table. We had to bring the Department of Economic Development to the table to fund the project. We had to bring the tech advisors to the table, to bring the tech companies to the table. And so it was really about the partnerships, and I think that's really at the heart of it. The same with the housing development. That was a partnership between the Housing Development Corporation, the Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development, and the New York City Housing Authority, because it was on the land for public housing. And so it was about those partnerships that actually allowed that project to be realized and to provide all of the type of funding, bonds, tax credits, et cetera, and so forth to make that project happen. And so, that's kind of, I think, at the foundation of it is really about collaboration. It's also about collaboration with nonprofit and public sector. It's a nonprofit organization that manages the greenhouse and the roof of that building. So it's through the partnership between this nonprofit and the developer that allows that to become realized. So I think that is really at the heart of it, partnerships between community and public sector, government, nonprofit. That's really how projects really get realized, I think, effectively and sustainably. To ensure that there are people that are behind supporting those spaces, ensuring that they're resourced over time, and that they continue to support communities over time. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for riding around this area while you were here before you came to speak. I am curious, because you did that, what did you see?
I had a wonderful tour guide, Mitch Silver, who and a number of other friends who took me around, and I got to see just the transformation of spaces. I mean, he talked about it through the lens of being the head of planning, and seeing the changes of the city over time. And so I think we went to Midtown, and we drove around downtown. Is that right? And so I got to see a lot of the new developments that. I didn't know what was here before, but I got to see some relationship between some areas that might have looked like what was here before and what is here now. So that is kind of a sense of what I got to see.
So my second question is, you talked about the the heritage. So did you see any of those older spaces that are today in the Black community being rapidly gentrified? We're working on transit, but that's, once that process started, those areas began to rapidly gentrify. And so in Raleigh, our affordable housing is literally hotels on the corner, on the outskirts of the town, at the, at the city. And so for affordable housing planning, how do you see pulling together partnerships? Is that something that the city or the county needs to be in the process of, or is that something that they need to reach out and involve the community in helping to pull the partnerships together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we grapple with that in New York City as well. When there's one community in particular called Edgemere and the Rockaways in Queens, It's, very similar to the many stories I've mentioned before, formerly Redline community, but also a community that experiences extreme flooding. Historic African American community. And so Hurricane Sandy hit that community in 2012 and decimated many of the homes. And so the city has gone through a process of trying to buy people out, but then also thinking about the space that's left and what to do with that space. And so they're trying to establish a model, a partnership with a community land trust. So the ways in which the space is redeveloped, it's not about top-down development, but really that is empowering and can really create a way for future development in this neighborhood that maybe the people that were that left, that's sold their land, maybe they might not be able to return, but those who are still there have a mechanism to be empowered, that they can actually lease to own land, they can own land, and that it can be owned by a land trust that is really working for the betterment of the people that live there. And so that's kind of one model that we're working towards. I've seen that work in other places as well, as a community land trust model. We also deal with the fact that, affordable housing is not really seen as affordable there, like not affordable to those who are lowest income. And that sort of like the median income that is being used to determine who gets to buy into affordable housing doesn't really include those who are lowest income. And so that is something, I can't tell you that we've solved all that issue in New York City, but that's definitely something that we're dealing with, particularly in communities that have been marginalized. And we're building affordable housing in those communities, and then those buildings wind up gentrifying those neighborhoods because even though they're affordable to some, they're not affordable to all. And so, I can't, I see you putting your thumbs up, I can't tell you that we've figured out that sort of vortex of how do we grapple with this issue. I think many cities are dealing with it, but I think, we're sort of toying with this community land trust model as a way that can be more empowering and more inclusive in terms of the delivery of affordable housing.
First of all, thank you so much for this eye-opening lecture. I'm from Japan originally, and so I just never felt this sort of racial disconnect like I see here. Mm-hmm. The challenge it face. I mean, when I first came here, I saw it as a sort of, I embraced the fact that this is a very diverse community. And after living here for 10 plus years, I realized there's challenge come with it. You're trying to tackle something that a lot of people are trying to figure out, this kind of close the gap between the community. There must be enormous pressure. It's like a lot of experiment. What is the best solution? I just wonder how you deal with that pressure. You're trying to tackle something that really needs answer. And also people who are skeptical of what you're trying to do. How do you deal with those folks who might be not as on board or supportive of what you're trying to accomplish?
Man, that's a great question. I mean, all of these are great questions. And, I appreciate that question because for the past 7 years working with government, it has been challenging and very, full of pressure because I'm working for an organization that is, and working with really wonderful, talented people we're trying our best to do things differently. We're trying our best to serve the public interest, but then we're also working for an organization that has not had good standing in the neighborhood or community that we're working in. And so we have to deal with that. We have to sort of create space where we're acknowledging that there's this organization that we work for has this not great history in a community, acknowledge and reckon with that. And also oftentimes, myself as a person of color, my colleagues, people of color, working in a community of people that look like us, but knowing that the solutions that we're offering that they are available may not be the best solution for that community. So it's not easy. We try our best to, or at least I try our best to offer as much information as possible. So try to be as transparent as possible about why particular decisions are being made and what limitations the agency has. Like, for example, I worked for the Housing Development Agency. It's an agency that develops housing. We don't develop parks, we don't develop streets, we develop housing. So if we have a piece of land that we own and we understand that there's a need for affordable housing in that community, the tool that we have available to us is developing housing. But sometimes people, they don't want housing there. They want a park. And so I try to be, I try to make sure that we have the information available to people to help them understand that there is this need, there is this existing need in the community, and this is the way that we're trying to address that need. And here are some trade-offs. Here are some wins that they get from having this affordable housing, that it can really actually address other needs, that we can incorporate open space, and that there are some things that they might not get in that space. But actually, what we're trying to do is trying to serve a greater good for their community. So I try to be as transparent as possible and help people understand those trade-offs in investments that you know, whatever agency I'm working for is trying to make in that community. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think it's important, just like knowledge exchange and trying to be as open as possible about all the information I hold, because people may not know. They may not have that information. And when they start to understand what are the challenges that like agencies or architects or designers are dealing with, then they might think differently. They might offer other solutions that could help to come to a middle ground. Yeah. I saw that there was a question here in the front.
Hi. So I had a question from a designer standpoint. I graduated from architecture school, Syracuse, 3 years ago.
Yay!
And I think something that I've been guilty of in studio projects and even in my years working is kind of having a lot of good ambitions when it comes to dealing with the range of issues that architecture is asked to deal with sometimes, in terms of being sustainable and dealing with equity issues and dealing with just really solving real life issues, where sometimes the easiest thing, or with the time constraints or whatever it is, we settle for things that are optically the solution. Or for example, if it's landscape and you want a building to be green, every studio project, I've done this, it's shameful now, but you slap a green roof on it and then you know you solve the problem. Or just in projects that try to deal with urban environments and they tend to look a certain way, and you put people of color in the renderings, even though it's not really doing things deeper. And I think it's not from a lack of good ambitions, because I feel like a lot of designers go into it with all the best ambitions. So I guess my question is more to, how do we as designers stop ourselves from settling for the optics? Or when it comes to the real world where you have all these different issues, like you're saying, you're tackling all these different problems, how do we push past, you know, what looks like it should be the right solution, or what looks like what the solution would be based on like the little research that we have, when we don't have, you know, every opportunity to, let's say, talk to every community member, really invest that time, because it takes time. So yeah, kind of a loaded question, but I feel like optically sometimes we get to solutions that should work, or they look like they should work, and we settle for that. And I think we do ourselves a disservice. I think your quote in the beginning from that convention was really challenging to that, where we do a lot of work but solve no problems. You know?
Yeah, you know, that's a really great point. And I think it's a journey. I don't think you sort of like arrive at a final place where you're just like, oh, I know I have a way of working that where my final project is going to solve all the problems. Design can't solve all the problems. I don't believe that design solves all the problems, but I think it can be a part of the solution. And so in that, I think research is a big part of that, and really trying to, if you're not able to connect with community, really trying to research what has been done there already. what has come out of that, what has been community sentiment about that. Sometimes you can find a lot of that on, just researching that community. You can really see things that have been said about work in the community, or community work that is happening. Like really explore what are community-based organizations doing? What kind of outcomes are they having? They might not be as resourced as the project that you're working on, but you might start to see some trends of what people are trying to accomplish. And then that might be something that you can incorporate into your project, but design it into your building or landscape or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And so I think building off of existing expertise, existing movements and projects that have been really rooted in community driven, and really exploring those can offer a lot of insight as to what can work, or what are ways that people are trying to address that challenge, or address a challenge with minimal resources, but that here you are designing a space with more resources, and how do you sort of amplify that work? So I think, there are many ways that you can connect to local expertise without actually being able to talk to people, if that answers your question, yeah. But I think research is key, and for us, when I was working with the Black Space Urbanist Collective, we created those set of principles because we wanted to hold ourselves accountable to that work, and make sure that at all times as we were designing and thinking and co-creating, that we had a set of values that allowed us to not stray and sort of create something that was superficial, but be really embedded in place and root our ideas in sort of just what we were learning about place.
Another round of applause for Ifeoma.